Alright, hello fellow sapiens, sit back, relax and prepare to wander through 4 billion years of quiet conflict. A story not of wars and empires, but of molecules, cells, and the ancient code still moving inside you. This is Sleepless Homo, soft science and slow storytelling. We're just humble researchers, speaking calmly into the dark, sharing stories from deep time for those who think best when the world is quiet. Now imagine standing on a world that does not yet know life. The sky above you is not blue, but choked with ash and gas. Oceans boil, not from sunlight, but from the heat still leaking out of Earth's fractured crust. The continents, if you can call them that, are newborn scars, cracked and glowing, drifting on currents of magma. Volcanoes howl where oceans might one day rise. The atmosphere is thick with carbon dioxide, methane, ammonia. Lightning strikes land that has no grass, no trees, no watchers. In this molten chaos there is no scent of earth after rain, no bird song, no memory, only fire, rock, and time. This was Earth around 4.5 billion years ago, the Hadean Eon, named not as poetry but precision, the age of hell. And yet it is from this brutal world that something began to stir. Not life, not yet, but the first conditions that would make life possible. For hundreds of millions of years, Earth was pummeled by what astronomers call the Late Heavy Bombardment, a rain of space debris from the forming solar system. Each impact was apocalyptic. Some boiled entire oceans. Others reshaped continents before they could settle. If anything fragile had begun to form, it would have been obliterated again and again. But amid the wreckage, something else was taking place. Energy, vast, uncontrolled and constant, was interacting with matter in every imaginable way volcanoes delivered minerals from deep within Earth. Lightning provided jolts of energy across chemically rich surfaces. Hydrothermal vents poured scalding gases and trace metals into churning seas. Ultraviolet radiation, deadly to us today, was then a wild source of molecular agitation. And there, in that cauldron, carbon danced with hydrogen, oxygen, sulfur, simple compounds, methane, ammonia, water vapor, mingled with trace elements like phosphorus and iron. No direction, no goal, just probability, repeated 1 trillion times over in every square inch of this young violent planet. Chemists now call these compounds prebiotic, meaning before biology. Molecules that do not live, but might give rise to something that does. And we have tried, in laboratories, to coax them into motion. In the mid-20th century, Stanley Miller and Harold Urey conducted one of the first experiments to simulate early Earth conditions. They mixed gases thought to exist in the Hadean atmosphere and subjected them to electrical sparks. After just a week, the mixture contained amino acids, the building blocks of proteins, not life, but not random either. Structure from storm. That was the beginning of our laboratory echoes. Since then, experiments have shown that more than 20 types of amino acids can emerge from simple chemical recipes when provided energy. Some scenarios rely on deep-sea vents. Others imagine tidal pools drying and rehydrating under a brutal sun. Still others suggest that some of the necessary molecules may have arrived from beyond Earth, inside comets or meteorites, as if life's ingredients were scattered across the cosmos, waiting for a wet, hot world to catch them. But let's not rush. None of this means life had yet appeared. We're still talking about molecules, not cells, not systems. But something happened during these long, brutal epochs somewhere. A chain of molecules formed that could persist, not because it was alive, but because it was stable. Among 1,000 fragile arrangements, one happened to hold together longer than the others, then another, and another. Stability, not intelligence, was the first filter of nature, and over time, some of these stable molecules developed another strange trait: reactivity. They interacted with other compounds, forming slightly different chains. In rare cases, they split and formed two similar chains. Some broke apart instantly, others lasted a little longer. A tiny number began to persist, not because they wanted to, but because their structure allowed it. And slowly, structure became behavior. This is the part that feels almost sacred. And yet, we must resist that instinct. What we describe here is not the spark of a soul. It is chemistry under pressure. But it is chemistry beginning to remember. These early chains, proto-replicators, may have looked nothing like DNA. Some scientists suggest RNA came first, a simpler cousin of the molecule that now defines heredity. Others think it was even simpler, short peptides, or autocatalytic networks, or minerals forming templates for reactions to repeat. We don't know, and we may never know for certain, but the principle is what matters. Out of a world of fire, a few structures began to copy themselves, imperfectly, but often enough to persist. And in a world without predators, without timekeepers, without competition, that was enough. Replication was the first act of defiance against entropy, against the pull toward disorder that governs the entire universe. And the moment it began, a new kind of struggle was born. No longer was stability enough. Now copies could compete. Some were faster, some were more durable. Others perhaps used up fewer resources. A war began, slow, silent, molecular. No blood, no teeth, just numbers. Which chain could make more of itself, faster, before the raw materials ran out? This was not life as we know it. But it was evolution's first whisper. A world where structure became competition. The paradox is stark. Life, which we associate with harmony and beauty, began as the outcome of violence and chance, not directed by a hand, not shaped by will, but guided by the rules of chemistry and filtered by the brutal sieve of time. And we must be honest, we do not yet know how the leap from replication to metabolism occurred. We do not yet know how the first membrane formed, enclosing these fragile chains and creating the first inside versus outside. We have clues. Some believe lipids formed spontaneously, creating tiny bubbles that enclosed the early replicators. Others suggest clay surfaces provided scaffolding for reactions to repeat and intensify, but there is no fossil of the first cell, only shadows, only implications. What we do know is this: the Earth, once thought uninhabitable, was in fact perfectly suited to create life, not in spite of its chaos, but because of it. The heat, the lightning, the poison, all of it provided the energy and opportunity for molecules to find each other, and that finding, repeated across billions of waves and over millions of years, eventually became memory, and then, perhaps, intent. But not yet. There is no evidence for gods in these early oceans, no sign of spirit or choice, only heat, chance, and the long patience of molecules. And yet, from these ingredients something happened that changed the cosmos forever. A tiny shift. One structure, copying itself better than the rest. One molecule that refused to disappear. From that quiet act of selfish survival, every flower, every insect, every child, every song has emerged. It is not a poetic beginning, but it is a beginning. We are the consequence of that first defiance. A chain of molecules stretched over 4 billion years, still trying to replicate, still trying to outlast decay. And we, who speak and love and wonder, are made of the same atoms that once tumbled in those early storms. We are their latest arrangement, their longest echo. The war, if you can call it that, had already begun, not with soldiers, but with shapes. If you're listening while falling asleep, while working, or somewhere between, let me know in the comments. And if you drift off mid-episode, the timestamps below are here to guide you back. If you enjoy this calm way of learning, liking and subscribing gently helps more restless minds find their way to the firelight. No urgency, no noise, just slow questions with long answers, and as always, stay curious, stay calm. What if I told you the first battle in the history of life began without teeth, without claws, without even a heartbeat? That it started not in jungles or oceans, but in a place so small no eye could see it, and with contestants that had no minds, no wants, no awareness, but still, somehow, had something to lose. Somewhere, deep in Earth's primordial waters more than 4 billion years ago, a molecule made a mistake, it copied itself. And in that act of unknowing mimicry, a second version appeared. A structure almost identical to the first. The mistake, it turned out, was survival. And survival, as we would slowly learn, is contagious. We tend to think of life as something defined by breath, or motion, or need. But long before lungs, or hunger, or fear, there was only structure, chemical shapes formed by chance, drifting through a soup of carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, phosphorus, simple elements, waiting. Most molecules dissolved within seconds, split apart by heat or light or chaos, but once in a while something improbable happened. A string of atoms held its form a little longer, then a little longer still. The physics of its shape allowed it to persist, and eventually persistence allowed for replication. Not all replication is alike. Crystals grow, after all, and flames spread, but they do not pass on mistakes. What made this molecule different was that each time it made a copy of itself, that copy could make another, and another still. These were not perfect clones, errors slipped in. Tiny substitutions, changes in arrangement, but the structure, the capacity to make more, remained. And suddenly, chemistry had crossed a line. It was no longer just matter, it had become memory. This new kind of molecule, likely something resembling RNA, did not think or want or plan, it simply fit. In its surroundings, it had the right charge, the right shape, the right stickiness to attract the elements needed to form its own reflection. It was not alive in the way we use the word now, but it did what all living things eventually do. It multiplied, and it endured. Then something even stranger occurred. Another variant formed, slightly different. Perhaps it copied itself faster, or used fewer resources, or resisted heat more effectively. And for the first time, two versions of structure occupied the same chemical niche, each one trying to continue. Each one, by its very nature, reducing the resources available to the other. There was no hatred here, no malice, only consequence. If one structure made 10 copies while the other made 2, over time the first would crowd the second into extinction. And if a third came along that outpaced them both, the cycle would begin again. This was the beginning of competition. Not the survival of organisms, but of patterns, of instructions. It was the first appearance of selfishness, not as desire, but as geometry. A self-copying molecule, by existing, made it harder for other shapes to do the same. It was not evil. It was not wise. It simply worked. We have tried to model these ancient battles in modern labs. Some experiments begin with pools of synthetic RNA strands and watch as faster replicators overtake slower ones. Others use catalytic networks that promote their own stability, growing in number while outcompeting others. Even in the simpler setups, patterns emerge. Diversity blooms, but never without cost. There are winners. There are losers. and the only consistent reward is persistence. This leads to a strange and humbling realization. Life did not begin as cooperation. It began as conflict. Not war as we know it, but a silent, endless sorting of forms. The environment played judge. Temperature, acidity, salinity. All of it pressed down on the new replicators, choosing without intention which ones would remain. Each success gave rise to new pressures. A strand that replicated faster might deplete its own resources. One that resisted heat might become too rigid to change. Every advantage came with a trade-off, and those trade-offs shaped the future of life. Over millions of years, some of these replicators may have begun to assist one another. Certain sequences might catalyze the production of others, or form scaffolds that enhance stability. But even these brief alliances were subject to the same rule. Replicate or be forgotten. Nature, indifferent and ancient, rewarded only what endured. We do not know the exact identity of Earth's first replicator. It may have been RNA, capable of storing information and catalyzing reactions, or it may have been a simpler molecule, forming in mineral-rich pores around hydrothermal vents. Perhaps it was not even a single molecule, but a network of chemical interactions, none alive on their own, but collectively forming a system capable of replication. Whatever the path, the outcome was the same. Replication led to variation. Variation led to competition. And competition, filtered by time, became evolution's engine. The concept of a selfish replicator can sound dramatic, but it's just a way of saying that the success of one pattern comes at the expense of others. Every strand that copied itself used up resources that might have gone to something else. Over time, this bias in copying meant certain shapes dominated the pool, not because they deserved to, but because they could. What is haunting, and somehow beautiful, is that all life, including ours, descends from the lineages that won those first molecular battles. We are the great-grandchildren of successful mistakes. Every cell in your body, every trait you carry, every thought you have, began with a molecule trying to copy itself before it dissolved. A shape that could not feel or dream or ache, but whose descendants eventually could. This also means that the roots of life are not tranquil. They are not Eden. They are struggle written in chemistry. And yet from that struggle came complexity. Over time, replicators evolved not just to copy themselves, but to protect their copies, to encase them, to pass them along more efficiently. Those who survived the longest were not just fast or stable, but inventive. They began to sculpt the environment around them, binding metals, absorbing energy, constructing primitive enclosures. Even here, at the molecular scale, you can see the early glimmers of adaptation. One strand might fold in a way that shields its vital sequences. Another might form loops that allow for faster catalysis. Each improvement changed the odds, and so the war continued, not with weapons, but with folding and reaction rates and molecular affinity. Complexity did not arise from planning, but from the blind math of survival. To say this aloud can feel bleak. If life is just replication with competition, where is the wonder? But look again. From molecules that simply did not fall apart came systems that could evolve, and from those systems came everything else. The forests, the oceans, the ache of memory, the joy of reunion, the hush of snowfall. None of these things would exist if that first molecule had not lingered long enough to make a second. This is the mystery, and perhaps the comfort. We do not know what that molecule was, but we are still shaped by its ambition, if that is even the right word. We are made not of matter alone, but of matter that remembers how to become itself again. And somewhere, beneath all our thoughts and fears and beliefs, that primal logic still operates. Copy yourself. Outlast. Persist. Somewhere in the deep sea, there are still molecules behaving the same way. They do not know they are ancient. They do not know they began something. But they continue. So perhaps the first living thing did have an enemy, not by choice, not by hatred, but simply by existing in a world where matter was limited and time unrelenting. That enemy was every other molecule that tried to do the same, and from that ancient silent contest came the blueprint of everything we are. There was no judge, no starting gun, just a molecule, then a copy, then the race. What if I told you that every tree, every insect, every whale and every human shares the same ancestor, not just metaphorically, but chemically, down to the language of life itself, not a species, not even a cell as we would recognize it, but a code, a single strand of instruction that billions of years ago began to win a quiet war no one remembers. By the time Earth was around 1 billion years old, the chaos of its infancy had begun to settle. Volcanoes still rumbled. The atmosphere remained strange, thick with methane and almost no oxygen, but seas had formed, tides pulled by the moon had begun their long rhythm, and in the warmth of these young oceans life had been at work for hundreds of millions of years. Unseen, unthinking, unrelenting molecular replicators, the earliest whisper of what we now call biology, had not only appeared, but diversified. Different lineages of chemical life, none complex, likely coexisted. Some may have used RNA to store their pattern, other simpler systems now erased from memory. These early forms may have interacted, interfered, competed for energy and space. Life did not arrive all at once, perfectly formed, but in 1,000 primitive versions, and for a while perhaps they all endured. Then something shifted, not a revolution, but a refinement. A system arose, one arrangement of molecular machinery that proved itself more stable, more efficient, or simply more lucky than the rest. It stored its instructions in a specific kind of code. It built proteins using a modular toolkit of just 20 amino acids. It surrounded itself with a membrane, perhaps crafted from lipids that clung together naturally in water, and most importantly it passed that exact system to its descendants. Not a perfect replica, but close enough to endure. This entity, or more likely, this population of near-identical entities, is what we now call LUCA, the last universal common ancestor. It was not the first living thing, it was not the most intelligent, nor the most elegant, it was the one that made it through. We know Luca existed not because we found its bones, there were no bones, but because of what we still carry. Every living thing on Earth, from mushrooms to mosquitoes to mammals, uses the same genetic alphabet: adenine, thymine, cytosine, and guanine. The code that instructs a coral how to build its skeleton is written in the same chemical dialect as the one that tells your cells how to divide. The structure of the ribosome, the little protein factory inside every cell, is so consistent across all life that we can align its sequences like family trees. The farther apart two species are, the more small changes we see. But the core remains. That is not coincidence. It is inheritance. Fossil evidence is faint from this deep time, but not absent. In ancient rock formations from Australia and South Africa, dated to over 3.5 billion years ago, we find stromatolites, layered structures built by microbial mats in shallow seas. While we cannot sequence their genes, their presence suggests that life capable of communal behavior, of structure building and energy harnessing, had already emerged. And if these organisms were building, then their ancestors had already been refining the machinery of life for untold ages. What happened to the others? The ones that used a different code, or lacked membranes, or folded their proteins in some forgotten way? We don't know. They left no record we can read. It is possible they were outcompeted, their resources siphoned away by Luca's descendants. It is possible they were destroyed by shifts in temperature, by exposure to ultraviolet radiation, by the relentless pressure of mutation. Perhaps some fell victim to their own success, growing too fast, too fragile, burning out before they could stabilize. But in a world without fossils, without eyes, without memory, extinction leaves no tombstone. What matters is that only one lineage survived, one molecular toolkit, one method of building proteins, reading sequences, making copies. And once that system took hold, it became nearly unchangeable. Mutations within it could occur, but the framework itself was locked in. Changing the genetic code midstream would be like changing the layout of a keyboard while writing a book. Disastrous unless every letter changes at once, and so it stayed. The code became a kind of fossil in motion, written in every living thing. That uniformity, more than anything, is why we believe Lucia existed. It is statistically improbable that such a specific code, such a detailed and arbitrary arrangement of signals and meanings, would arise twice independently. There are, after all, many possible ways to encode life's instructions, but all known life uses one. The same codons mean the same things in plants and bacteria and humans that cannot be explained by chance alone. Luca was likely not a single individual, but a population of similar organisms exchanging genes. It may have lived in hydrothermal vents at the bottom of ancient oceans, where chemical gradients provided energy in a world without sunlight. It may have fed on sulfur or iron or simple carbon compounds. Its genome may have been messy, its life short. But it carried the architecture we all use now. And in that sense, Luca is not just our ancestor. It is our template. We are its continuation. There's something eerie about knowing that your eyes, your hands, your thoughts are built atop a platform first assembled in a boiling sea long before the moon had settled into its orbit, that every breath you take depends on machinery designed by accident, optimized by competition, and passed down without pause for billions of years. There is no part of your body that does not echo Luca's first solutions. And yet, Luca is also unknowable. We can reconstruct parts of its genome by comparing what is shared across modern life. We can guess at its environment, infer its metabolism, simulate its chemical systems, but we cannot see it. Its bones, if it had any, were molecules. Its story survives only in the parts of us we do not choose, the sequences we inherit, the rhythms our cells obey. It is tempting to imagine Luca as a solitary figure, a lone microbe triumphing over a hostile world. But that would be a myth. The reality is quieter and more complex. Luca was not the first. It was not even alone. It was the one whose descendants remained. That may be due to efficiency. It may be due to dumb luck. In the absence of other records, we must hold both possibilities. What it means, though, is profound. There was a moment in Earth's early history when biology narrowed, when the open field of experimental life collapsed into a single path, and every organism since has walked that path, changing the landscape as it goes, but never the road itself. In evolutionary biology, there is a concept called canalization, the idea that once a system becomes stable enough, it resists change. The valley grows too deep to escape. Luca's code, its ribosomes, its core metabolism, became such a valley, not because it was perfect, but because it worked just well enough and changed just slowly enough to outlast the alternatives. This is not destiny. This is not design. It is what happens when systems persist. What remains becomes what is. So when we ask why all living things share one ancestor, the answer may be disappointing to those who seek poetry the others were erased. and we are what was left behind. But perhaps there is a different kind of beauty in that, a clarity, because it means we are connected not just by biology, but by time. All of us, from whale to wasp to willow, are branches of the same ancient tree, and the roots of that tree are still alive in us, coded into every strand of DNA, whispering of an ocean we no longer remember. No one crowned Luca. There was no final battle, no audience, no applause, only quiet endurance, only survival. What if I told you the first act of cooperation in history began with an attempted murder? That the root of every tree, every mind, every heartbeat lies not in harmony, but in invasion. About 2 billion years ago, Earth's oceans had already been alive for over 1 billion more. The microbial world was thriving, if thriving means outlasting entropy. Single-celled organisms drifted through chemical gradients, harvested energy from sulfur or light, and divided endlessly into near copies of themselves. These cells were small, efficient, and self-contained, closed loops of survival, and for an unimaginably long stretch of time, that was enough. Life persisted. But it did not change much. Then, somewhere in these ancient waters, one small cell encountered another. Not a passive meeting, one cell engulfed the other. This was not unusual. Microbes had begun to bump with purpose. Some had evolved primitive tools to pierce or dissolve one another. Others developed ways to absorb and digest. These were not predators in the animal sense. They were molecules wrapped in membranes, blindly exploiting chemistry. But in this moment, something rare happened. The cell that was swallowed did not die. Perhaps its outer membrane resisted digestion. Perhaps the host's enzymes were weak. Or perhaps, and this is the prevailing theory, both cells discovered by accident that their coexistence offered mutual benefit. The engulfed cell, likely a small bacterium adapted to handling oxygen, could process energy more efficiently than the host. The host, in turn, provided shelter, raw materials, and chemical balance. The two were not friends, but they were useful to each other, and usefulness, in the story of life, is enough. Over time, the internal guest stopped being a guest. Its outer defences faded. Its genome shrank. With many of its genes transferred into the host's nucleus, it no longer lived independently. It became an organelle, a part of the host, yet still genetically distinct. This is what we now call the mitochondrion. That moment, subtle and silent, was one of the most significant in the history of biology, because from it arose a new kind of cell, the eukaryote. Unlike the simpler prokaryotes, eukaryotic cells had internal complexity, membrane-bound compartments, linear chromosomes, a nucleus that organised their genetic material, and within them powerhouses, mitochondria, turning oxygen into usable energy with far greater efficiency than before. This new architecture unlocked potential, the ability to grow larger, to store more information, to interact in more elaborate ways with the environment. It laid the foundation for everything that would come after. The theory behind this origin is called endosymbiosis, first formally proposed in the 20th century by biologist Lynn Margulis. At the time, it was controversial, but today it is widely accepted, supported by overwhelming evidence mitochondria have their own DNA. That DNA is circular, like a bacterium's. They divide independently inside our cells, not through the cell's machinery, but through their own. They even carry ribosomes that more closely resemble bacterial ones than those of the host. In every way that matters, mitochondria are the faded ghosts of ancient bacteria, ancestors that were once free, and they are not alone. In plants and algae, another such merger occurred. A separate bacterial lineage capable of photosynthesis was engulfed and domesticated. These guests became chloroplasts, the organelles that capture sunlight and turn it into sugar. Once again, an act of consumption ended not in digestion, but in union. Once again, the parasite became the power source. To say that this was intentional would be wrong. There was no plan, no foresight, only coincidence sculpted by selection. And yet, the implications are enormous. Without mitochondria, there would be no large cells, no nerve signals, no movement faster than diffusion, no structures taller than a single cell. In a very real sense, all complex life, all animals, all plants, all fungi, descends from a single, improbable alliance between enemies. The elegance of this story is matched only by its discomfort, because it means that cooperation, one of biology's most cherished behaviours, may have begun not with love, but with failure, a failure to kill, a failure to digest. And that failure became opportunity. We do not know how many times endosymbiosis was attempted before it succeeded. There may have been countless failed mergers, invaders too virulent, hosts too fragile, partnerships that collapsed before they stabilized. But what remains in today's cells tells us that at least one worked, and once it worked, the resulting cell type outperformed its simpler cousins. Over time, it spread, diversified, filled new niches. It didn't eliminate prokaryotes, they still dominate Earth by number, but it opened a door they had never walked through. The war of life, once defined by exclusion and replication speed, now included diplomacy of a kind. Cells began to integrate, to contain, to coordinate. It wasn't peace, but it was possibility. What is remarkable is that even today, every eukaryotic cell in your body carries the legacy of this merger. Your mitochondria are not just batteries, they are ancient survivors, still holding a fragment of the genome they brought into the deal. Their DNA, separate from yours, is inherited almost exclusively from your mother. Every breath you take, every muscle that moves, every thought you have, all powered by the quiet churn of these long-digested guests. They do not speak, they do not ask, but they remember. Some scientists argue that this event, the origin of the mitochondrion-bearing cell, was a bottleneck in life's history, that it happened once, maybe only once, in all of Earth's 4 billion-year timeline. If that is true, then every complex life form is the product of a single act of cellular mercy, a fluke that could have ended in acid and death, but instead created a union. And so in the lineage of life's long war, a new strategy appeared. Not just outcompete, not just replicate, but integrate, absorb, reuse, and build something neither side could have achieved alone. This shifts our sense of what evolution means. It is not only survival of the fastest or the strongest. Sometimes it is survival of the most adaptable, the most cooperative, even the most forgiving. Of course, the balance remains delicate. Mitochondria can still misfire. They can mutate, degrade, fail. Some diseases of aging are linked to the gradual decline of these ancient symbionts, but most of the time, the alliance holds. You're powered not by your body alone, but by the inheritance of a billion-year-old truce. We often imagine life's story as a tale of conquest, one lineage outcompeting another, one mutation beating the rest. But this chapter reminds us that sometimes the deepest transformations come from unexpected union, that what began as a threat can become a companion, that survival, in its most elegant form, may come from letting the other live inside you. It is strange to think that your cells are not truly singular, they are consortia, whispers of past lives, locked in biochemical choreography. They pulse not only with your genes, but with the memory of a billion-year-old agreement made without words, honoured without question. What if I told you that your body is not a single being, but a fragile ceasefire? That beneath your skin, trillions of once independent cells live side by side, cooperating not out of kindness, but because long ago evolution forced them to choose, unite or be forgotten. Around 1 billion years ago, the oceans were still ruled by single cells. For hundreds of millions of years, these tiny entities had survived alone, drifting, absorbing, dividing. Life was abundant, but not large. Not yet. Each organism was self-contained, its fate tied to its own success. And for a long time, that was enough. But something changed. Slowly, then more often, some cells began to stay together after dividing. Instead of breaking apart and floating away, they clung. At first, this was likely incidental. A fluke of chemistry, a sticky surface, a twist in the way membranes behaved. But clumps became colonies. Colonies began to specialize. And those that could coordinate, even in primitive ways, gained new abilities. Sticking together had advantages. Larger size meant fewer predators. Shared membranes allowed for more efficient nutrient exchange. Cells at the edge could absorb light or chemicals, while those in the middle were protected. These clusters were not yet organisms in the modern sense, but they were no longer just crowds. They were beginning to function as wholes. But this raised a problem, a serious one. Once cells live together, they must play by rules, and some don't. A rogue cell that replicates too fast, that takes more than its share of energy, or that stops performing its task gains a short-term benefit, but at the expense of the group. If left unchecked, it could grow out of control, disrupt the colony, and collapse the system. In other words, life's oldest conflict had now moved inside. So how did evolution solve this? How did trillions of cells, each descended from ancestors that once competed for everything, learn to cooperate? The answer is simple and quietly profound. They were clones. Most cells in your body carry the same DNA. When the first multicellular organisms evolved, their cells came from a single fertilized ancestor, one zygote, one instruction set, copied again and again. Because the genetic information was shared, the interests of the cells were aligned. Helping the body helped the genome they all carried. Even if a liver cell could not reproduce on its own, it contributed to the survival of the body, which in turn passed on its genes, the same genes the liver cell held. This genetic unity created a kind of enforced cooperation. Cells that followed the plan, divide when told, perform their function, die when necessary, were rewarded indirectly. Their identical copies survived in the next generation. Cells that broke the rules, that tried to divide selfishly or ignore signals, faced consequences. Some were killed by neighbouring cells, others triggered stress responses, and most simply failed to outcompete the larger system. Evolution selected not just for individual survival, but for internal harmony. Organisms that kept their cells in line lasted longer, grew larger, left more descendants. This was not a perfect system. It still isn't. Sometimes, a mutation allows a cell to escape its constraints. It begins dividing uncontrollably, ignoring the signals that normally guide its behaviour. It becomes what we now call cancer, a cell that reverts to its ancestral instincts, choosing replication over cooperation. But even then, the body fights back. Tumour suppressor genes, programmed cell death, immune surveillance, all evolved as defences against internal betrayal. Life, it turns out, not only had to survive the outside world, it had to survive itself. What makes this remarkable is how rare those rebellions are. You're made of over 30 trillion cells. They divide billions of times across a lifetime, and yet most behave. Most follow the ancient plan: contribute, specialize, die. Your fingers form because some cells know when to stop growing. Your blood flows because others know how to change shape. Your skin renews because cells listen for damage and respond only when needed. Every heartbeat, every blink, every breath is built on the quiet obedience of cells that once would have lived alone. We see the earliest fossils of multicellular life in rocks around 600 million years old. Strange, soft-bodied creatures, preserved as impressions in ancient seabeds. They had no eyes, no organs, no mouths. But they were more than single cells. They were bodies, however primitive. And with bodies came roles. A surface cell is not the same as a buried one. Some absorb, some move, some support. This division of labour, what biologists call differentiation, only works if every cell agrees to stay in its lane, and staying in one's lane requires giving something up, the freedom to replicate at will. In this sense, multicellularity was not just a new form of life, it was a social contract, a set of rules encoded in chemistry, enforced by selection and obeyed by lineages that learned, at a cellular level, that sometimes survival means silence. Not every cell would make it to the next generation, but the ones that cooperated increased the chances that their shared genome would. And in evolution, that is enough. There are still organisms today that blur the line. Colonial bacteria form mats and tubes. Algae like volvox live in spherical colonies where a few cells give up reproduction to help others slime mold shift between solitary and collective phases. These living fossils remind us that multicellularity was not a single leap, but a slow negotiation, an ongoing experiment in what cells could do together that they could never do alone. And the answer, over time, was staggering. Larger bodies, longer lives, nervous systems, mobility, sensing, decision-making. But all of that still rested on a foundation built during those early experiments. A fragile trust among clones. Even today your body lives in quiet tension. Every cancer is a failed truce. Every autoimmune flare, a miscommunication. But most of the time the agreement holds. You're not a single being. You're a collective. A committee of ancient cells, each one with its own lineage, bound by a shared script. You're the descendant of 1 billion years of ceasefires. Yet the alignment of cellular interests was not the end of the negotiation. For as these early multicellular forms grew in size and complexity, they faced new pressures, not just from within, but from the world around them. Diffusion, the simple process by which molecules move from one place to another, is efficient only over short distances. A ball of cells too large or too dense could starve its interior. This physical constraint quietly sculpted the architecture of early bodies, pushing evolution toward internal pathways, pores, and the earlier circulatory channels, not organs, not yet. But hints, cellular corridors designed not to think or feel, but simply to feed the parts that could no longer reach the outside world. This necessity for coordination brought with it a new form of vulnerability. As soon as some cells began relying on others for survival, failure in one part could ripple through the whole. A cell that stopped transporting or filtering or holding structural tension might cause collapse. This interdependence demanded reliability, not perfection. Mutation is constant, but predictability across billions of divisions, and so systems emerged not only to monitor damage, but to anticipate at checkpoints during replication. Enzymes that scoured DNA for errors, cells that, upon detecting unfixable flaws, chose suicide over risk, a process known as apoptosis. The willingness to self-destruct for the greater good was not noble. It was selected for. Bodies that harboured unreliable cells did not last. Lineages that encoded self-control endured. With size also came time. Larger organisms took longer to grow, longer to reproduce. Some of the earliest multicellular forms may have lived for years rather than hours. This extended lifespan brought a delayed payoff. Cells might toil for decades before the body reproduced, before their shared genes were passed on. In this delay lay an evolutionary gamble, one that only worked if most of the cells stayed loyal for most of the time. And remarkably, they did not because they knew their purpose, but because selection over millions of years had carved away those who did not. Even today, echoes of this cellular restraint appear in the slow, graceful decay of aging telomeres. The caps at the ends of chromosomes shorten with each division, a ticking clock limiting how often most cells can copy themselves. This limit is not a flaw, but a defense, a reminder that even at the microscopic scale, longevity requires boundaries. From the outside, multicellular life may seem like an expansion, a move towards size, power, possibility. But on the inside, it is a story of discipline, of ancient agreements enforced by genes, of chaos held back by chemistry, of a million individual instincts softened into one. The war did not end. But here, for the first time, life learned how to wage it within. What if I told you the first terror in Earth's history wasn't a storm or a volcano, but another living thing coming straight at you, mouth open, hungry? Roughly 540 million years ago, something irreversible began beneath the oceans. The world was already full of life, soft-bodied, slow, mostly passive. Sponges filtered water, worm-like creatures tunneled through sediment. Tiny plankton floated in chemical silence. But then, seemingly all at once in the fossil record, life turned sharp. Organisms began developing tools not just to move or anchor or feed on particles, but to chase, pierce, crush, and consume other life. The era of predation had begun. We call it the Cambrian explosion, not because it happened in a single burst, but because it left a sudden geological signature. Fossil beds like those at Burgess Shale in Canada and Chengjiang in China show an astonishing diversity of animal forms appearing in what is, geologically speaking, the blink of an eye. Creatures with eyes, limbs, spines, armour, some strange, some familiar. But what's most striking is that many of these innovations are built for war. One of the earliest apex predators was Anomalocaris, the abnormal shrimp. Its body stretched more than 1/2 metre long, a giant by Cambrian standards. It had large grasping appendages near its mouth, circular jaws lined with hard plates, and complex stalked eyes. It swam with undulating lobes, hovering above the seafloor like a ghost, scanning for movement. When it found prey, trilobites perhaps, it would lunge, grasp, and crush. And this prey was not defenceless. Trilobites, the now iconic armoured arthropods of the Paleozoic, had evolved hard exoskeletons, their outer shells fossilised beautifully. These shells weren't just structural, they were shields, a response to pressure from predators. Some trilobite fossils even show healed bite marks, suggesting they survived attacks and regrew damaged parts. Life, for the first time, had to outlive not just the elements, but each other. This marked a new kind of evolutionary pressure. Before this, survival often meant adapting to one's environment. Chemical gradients, light, temperature, toxins. But now the challenge came from other organisms, each adapting in real time to what the others did. If you grew faster, I grew sharper. If you hid better, I saw better. If you built armour, I learned to break it. This reciprocal escalation, an arms race, transformed evolution into a feedback loop. Adaptation begot adaptation. It is likely that these predator-prey dynamics drove much of the diversification we see in Cambrian fossils. Eyes emerged in multiple lineages. Independently, musculature became more defined, nervous systems more complex, movement more coordinated. Predation didn't just cause fear, it caused flourishing. Because to avoid being eaten, you had to innovate. And this innovation wasn't just physical, it was behavioural. Some animals began to burrow more deeply into sediments. Others clumped together, forming schools or colonies. Some became nocturnal. Strategy, in its earliest form, began to shape anatomy. Evolution had always sculpted form. Now it began to sculpt tactics. This also meant that energy budgets shifted. Killing takes effort. So does running. Species began to partition their resources differently. Stronger muscles, quicker reflexes, larger brains. Some animals became leaner, faster. Others bulked up, opting for fortification. Every body plan became a compromise, a silent negotiation between offence and defence. Not everything survived this new battlefield. Many Cambrian organisms vanished soon after they appeared. The fossil record shows this as well. Bursts of life followed by winnowing. But the general trend held. Once predation entered the equation, it never left. Even the simplest animals today retain traces of this ancient logic. Shells, speed, camouflage, toxins. You are the descendant of something that once either escaped or devoured. This phase also redefined what it meant to be alive. Until this point, life was passive, filtering, absorbing, waiting. Now it chased and fled. Risk entered the picture. So did decision. Nervous systems began to matter. The Cambrian seas were not just louder in motion, they were louder in information. A shadow could be safety or death. And so perception became power. Eyes, antennae, vibration sensors. The ability to know or guess what was out there became as important as the ability to defend against it. In that sense, the Cambrian explosion was not only a physical revolution, it was a cognitive one. What began in those ancient oceans still echoes in every predator-prey interaction today. A wolf stalking deer, a falcon diving on prey, a spider sensing a tremor in its web. But the first time it happened, it was quiet. No cries, no awareness. Just instinct and evolution colliding in a murky sea. Two organisms, once passive, now aware of each other and the consequences of being too slow. The war that had once been molecular, then cellular, had entered the world of motion and muscle, and it would never turn back. But this new predator-prey reality did more than shape bodies. It began to organise space, and with it, ecosystems. For the first time, location mattered in more than just chemical terms. The Cambrian seafloor became a map of risk and refuge. Flat plains of soft sediment were exposed and dangerous, patrolled by swift swimmers. Crevices, reefs, and burrows offered shelter, but limited access to light or food. Organisms began to specialise by position. Some adapted to open water, some to tight corners, others to living beneath the sand entirely. Where you lived was no longer just a matter of tolerance, it was a decision about who you might meet. This spatial structuring introduced another layer to evolution, the shaping of ecological roles. The concept of a niche, a place within a system where a species fits, both physically and functionally, has its roots here. Cambrian creatures didn't just evolve to survive, but to survive somewhere. Some became grazers, sweeping detritus from rock. Others filtered particles from the water column. Predators stalked above or waited motionless below. These roles weren't coordinated, of course. There was no plan. but they formed a network, fragile, interlocked, that we now call an ecosystem. And once these systems stabilized, they began to do something remarkable. They could collapse. For the first time, the death or decline of one species could affect many others. A predator too successful might eliminate its prey and starve. A grazer population might overconsume and crash. These were not yet the complex food webs of later eras, but the principles were emerging. A web of interactions where survival was no longer an individual affair. The war had grown roots. Meanwhile, fossil beds like Sirius Passet and Emu Bay began capturing not only the creatures themselves but signs of their interactions. Bite marks, scars, crushed shells. These aren't just fossils, they're moments of impact, silent records of struggle and survival. Some trilobite fossils show repair, evidence of regeneration, a limb lost, then regrown. The ability to recover became a trait worth selecting, not just escape, but resilience. There is poetry too in what didn't survive dozens of Cambrian body plans, entire experiments in shape and movement, vanished. Worms with backward legs, flattened ovals with strange frills, eyes that pointed inward. They failed not because they were weak, but because something else was faster, sharper, or more aware. Evolution is not cruel, but it is constant, and in these ancient seas it showed no mercy for the unfit. Still, from that churning epoch came the ancestors of nearly all modern animal groups, mollusks, arthropods, chordates, their blueprints etched in time, refined through conflict. The world would never be passive again. The living had learned to pursue, to flee, and to outmaneuver life in hunting life, had finally discovered complexity. What if I told you that the first forests were not places of peace, but arenas of silent warfare, where green things fought back? Roughly 400 million years ago, life took a difficult step. After billions of years in water, some organisms began to brave the exposed, desiccating surface of the continents. The first to succeed were the plants. They came as mosses, liverworts, and small vascular forms no taller than your knee. But within tens of millions of years, evolution had sculpted something astonishing. Tree-like giants with thick woody trunks and root systems that pierced the soil. These were the first forests, not yet leafy as we know them, but towering nonetheless. Dense, wet, and full of shadow. A new world, a new battlefield. The moment plants blanketed the land, they became food. Arthropods, once confined to damp marine sediments, now scuttled across soil and bark. Millipedes grazed mosses. Primitive mites nibbled spores. But with the Carboniferous period came a leap in size and ambition. Insects with wings began to fly among the towering ferns. Dragonflies with wingspans wider than a dinner plate hovered silently through humid groves. Their larvae stalked pools below while the adults dominated the air. And just as some insects hunted others, many evolved to feed on plants directly, their mandibles scraping, tearing, mining through soft green tissues. The plants responded, not by fleeing, but by transforming. Some thickened their cell walls, making their leaves tougher to chew. Others produced bitter compounds, the earliest toxins, that made their tissues taste foul or induce sickness in any insect foolish enough to feast. Thorns emerged not just to climb, but to harm. Spores became timed to seasons when grazers were less active, and still the insects evolved in turn. Some developed mandibles strong enough to puncture the defences. Others evolved enzymes to digest what was once poisonous. This was not a passive feast, it was co-evolution as combat. Adaptation calling forth counter-adaptation. Beneath this leafy duel, the soil darkened with complexity. Roots spread and merged with fungi, forming underground alliances. Mycorrhizal networks whispered nutrients from plant to plant. Above, the air thickened with oxygen, byproduct of photosynthesis on a planetary scale. Insects responded in kind, growing larger. Some say because more oxygen allowed their spiracles to support bigger bodies. Others point to the absence of aerial predators. Either way, size became power. Some ancient millipedes stretched over 2 meters long. The land was still ruled by invertebrates. Early tetrapods, the first 4-limbed vertebrates, joined this web of life as amphibious intruders. Some crawled onto land to escape aquatic predators. Others returned to feed on the abundant plant life. But plants had already rehearsed their defences in battles with insects. Chemical deterrents were indiscriminate. If you had a mouth, they had a molecule to confuse it. Herbivory became less about appetite and more about strategy. Only the clever or the tolerant could feed without cost. And still, the forest grew. Trees like lepidodendron and sigillaria rose as tall as modern palms. They did not flower, nor did they fruit, but they towered in silence, scattering spores into wind and time. Their bark was thick with patterns, their trunks hollow and often brittle. Fallen giants became ecosystems of their own, homes for detritivores, fungi and eggs. The forest was alive not just in growth, but in decay. Nothing stood still for long. Fossilized leaves from this time bear the signature of conflict. Serrated edges, holes in patterns, trails where a larva mined through the tissue layer by layer, some of the damage healed, other wounds fossilized mid-bite. These were not accidents. They were negotiations, nature's contracts, written in cellulose and chitin. And in this world, sight and smell became weapons. Insects used chemical cues to find edible plants. Plants evolved to mask their scent, or mimic the toxins of inedible cousins. Deception entered the war. The illusion of safety, the lie of nourishment. This arms race had no final blow, no peace treaty. It simply became more complex. By the end of the Carboniferous, entire ecosystems had stabilized into these silent wars, forests as vast arenas where no step, nibble or spore was without consequence. And from this arms race came something bigger than either side. These early forests altered the atmosphere, drawing down carbon dioxide and flooding the world with oxygen. They cooled the planet, seeded soils and carved river paths. In evolving to fight insects, plants remade the earth. This was no Eden. It was strategy in green. Yet while plants and insects duelled across forest floors and fern canopies, another battle began, one not of mouths or molecules, but of time. Speed became a weapon. Insects began coordinating their life cycles with seasonal cues, laying eggs to hatch precisely when spores burst or fresh fronds unfurled. Plants responded not by resisting directly, but by shifting their growth rhythms, some maturing faster, others staggering their reproduction to confuse the feeders. This war wasn't about brute force anymore. It was about timing, about outpacing your predator or outlasting your grazer. Reproduction, too, evolved into a strategic theatre. For plants, the spread of spores had always depended on luck, a gust of wind, a passing current. But on land, the air was less predictable, and moisture less guaranteed. Some began experimenting with height, growing taller to catch stronger winds. Others formed clustered spore cones, concentrating release. Insects, in turn, became accidental couriers. Crawling across reproductive structures, they unknowingly ferried genetic material from plant to plant. What began as sabotage slowly transformed into service, not cooperation, not yet, but foreshadowing. Meanwhile, beneath the canopy, darkness thrived. Decomposition accelerated in the warm, wet soils of the Carboniferous fallen trunks, became vast, spongy nurseries for insects, fungi, and early amphibians. Detritivores multiplied, creatures that fed on death, not life, and in doing so fueled the forest itself. Nutrients were recycled, soil thickened, and root systems grew deeper. It was a quiet feedback loop. The more complex the forest became, the more life it could host, and the more it needed to defend. This set the stage for specialization. Some insects evolved to feed on only one kind of leaf, or one stage of a plant's life cycle. Others mimicked the textures of bark, hiding in plain sight to avoid their own predators. Camouflage emerged not from artistic whim, but survival necessity. If you could look like a piece of fern, you might live long enough to mate. In response, plants began to modify not just their shape, but their chemistry, in ever more creative ways. Some secreted sticky resins, others released volatile compounds, primitive scents, to attract defenders. Certain tree-like species may have recruited predators indirectly, by becoming homes to predatory arthropods who kept leaf-eaters in check. This wasn't harmony, it was tactical détente. The enemy of my enemy is tolerable. By this point, the forest was no longer just a setting. It had become an engine of evolutionary experimentation, a testbed for form and function. Insects developed folding wings, allowing them to dart through narrow spaces, then hide. Plants layered their tissues, embedding silica or wax to make their surfaces slick, or sharp, or too tough to chew. Even the angles of leaves began to change, some turning vertical to reduce surface area, others clustering to confuse. All of this unfolded with no voice, no thought, just endless iteration. What worked persisted. What failed was reclaimed by the soil, and the soil, now rich with carbon from decaying trunks and roots, began to shift the planet itself. Over millions of years, these ancient forests pulled vast quantities of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, cooling the world. The war between plants and insects fought without flame or fang began to alter the global thermostat. And yet, despite all this pressure, some truces did form. Certain insect species began to specialize not in destruction, but in mutual benefit. Some laid eggs in the protective folds of plant structures without harming them. Others fed on waste, not tissue. The line between parasite and partner blurred. Nature is rarely binary. Still, the forest's silence was deceptive. Every leaf trembled with intent. Every shadow housed a contest. The buzzing of ancient wings, the subtle growth of thorns, the soft fall of spores. They were not gentle acts. They were the choreography of survival. And though none of these players knew it, their long battle was building the blueprint for future life. By pushing each other to adapt, they opened evolutionary doors that no single species could unlock alone. So when you imagine the Paleozoic forest, do not picture serenity, picture strategy. 1,000,000 quiet wars unfolding at once. Not chaos, but complexity. Life learning that to endure, you must both defend and deceive. And the trees, still rooted, did both. Imagine a silence so vast it chokes the wind. A stillness so complete, even extinction seems to hold its breath. Roughly 252 million years ago, life faced its darkest hour. Long before the age of giants or flowers or feathers, Earth itself turned hostile. Not with a single impact or instant apocalypse, but with a slow-motion suffocation, a planetary betrayal that unfolded over hundreds of thousands of years. The Permian period, which had once thrummed with ecosystems of complexity, would end not with a whimper, but with fire, gas, and silence. The first warning came from the north. where ancient tectonic fractures in what is now Siberia cracked open the crust. From these wounds poured lava, not a single eruption but a relentless flood. The Siberian traps, as we call them now, disgorged millions of cubic kilometres of molten rock across the continent. But it wasn't the lava that caused the mass death. It was the invisible aftermath. Gases. Volcanic plumes belched carbon dioxide and methane into the atmosphere on an unimaginable scale, triggering global warming of lethal intensity oceans. Once blue and teeming began to suffocate. Warmer waters hold less oxygen. Currents faltered. The deep seas went anoxic, stagnant and toxic. Bacteria that thrive in low oxygen environments multiplied, releasing hydrogen sulfide, a gas both deadly to life and destructive to ozone. Sunlight grew harsh, filtered through thinning skies. Coral reefs, which had stood for hundreds of millions of years, crumbled. Entire clades of marine invertebrates simply vanished from the fossil record trilobites, once the emblems of ancient seas disappeared entirely. On land, forests withered, rain cycles faltered, ash darkened skies, acid rain stripped nutrients from the soil. Insects, those tireless survivors of the Carboniferous, suffered their only mass extinction in history. Amphibians and synapsids, the distant relatives of what would one day be mammals, faced drought, heat, and famine in a landscape that no longer obeyed its own rhythms. The result was staggering. Nearly 90% of all species on Earth vanished. This was no pruning. It was a planetary reset. The fossil record bears witness to the void. Layers of rock almost empty of life, known as disaster faunas, where only the hardiest, simplest, or luckiest organisms endured small burrowers. Generalists, creatures that could tolerate heat, hunger, and poisoned air. But perhaps what is most humbling is not the scale of loss, but the scale of survival that something lived. That despite all odds, a few threads of the genetic tapestry held firm, not by fighting back, but by enduring. Life shrank into corners, into crevices, into the margins of existence. It paused and waited, and slowly, after eons of quiet, it began again. No war in evolution is more decisive than extinction. It erases not only creatures but possibilities. Entire body plans, entire experiments in biology gone, never to return. The great dying didn't just thin the tree of life, it snapped limbs from it. Yet even in this, the message is not despair, but resilience. That from devastation, life does not always roar back, but it does return. And as the earth cooled and the skies began to clear, the survivors emerged into a changed world. Fewer competitors, new niches, empty lands. What followed would be one of the greatest evolutionary radiations in history. But here, in this moment, that story has not yet begun. All that exists is a battered, breathing planet, and the quiet persistence of life that refused to disappear. But survival, in the aftermath, was not a triumph. It was a negotiation, a quiet, reluctant contract with a damaged world. Those who lived through the great dying emerged not stronger, but reduced. Species that once dominated entire ecosystems shrank in size, in number, in range. Complexity reversed. Ecosystems that once buzzed with layered interactions, predator, scavenger, grazer, decomposer, were stripped down to their barest components. In the fossil record, this emptiness is visible. For millions of years, biodiversity remained low. It is known as the coal gap, where lush forests no longer regenerated and rich plant layers gave way to barren sediment. The Earth had not just lost species, it had lost function. This pause in the planet's vitality reshaped evolution itself. With so much gone, the rules had changed. Old strategies no longer guaranteed survival. adaptations honed over eons now answered questions no longer being asked. What was valuable now was not speed or strength or brilliance, but flexibility. The generalists, those who could feed on many things, live in many places, tolerate disruption, they thrived. Specialization, once a mark of evolutionary refinement, had become a liability. The niche was now a gamble, and still the planet simmered. Even after the worst eruptions ceased, the aftershocks lingered. Greenhouse gases continued to trap heat. Ocean chemistry remained unstable. Recovery was not immediate. It took, by some estimates, over 10 million years. To compare, that's longer than humans have even existed as a species. Life returned slowly, uncertainly, step by tentative step. In this slow rebirth, the boundaries of resilience were redrawn. Microbial mats once again coated tidal flats. Simple plants crept across scorched soils. Early vertebrates, lean, unspecialized, durable, began to radiate outward, testing the silence. Not because they were better, but because the competition was gone. The battlefield had been cleared, and new players could now write new rules. There is something sobering in this. That Earth, without an asteroid or invader, could so thoroughly unmake itself that the very systems life depends on, atmosphere, ocean, climate, can shift just enough to erase nearly all of it. And that when this happened, there was no drama, no climax, just a long thinning out, a global breath held too long, and yet, here we are, every mammal, every tree, every child born today carries in its lineage the survivors of that bottleneck. Not the best, not the brightest, just the persistent. Genes that withstood suffocation, hunger, heat. Not because they deserved to, but because something in their simplicity, or their luck, was enough. It reminds us that extinction is not the end of the story, but a shape it sometimes takes. That the war of life is fought not just in teeth and claws, but in silence, in whether an egg hatches, whether a spore catches wind, whether a root finds moisture in a dying forest. There's a humility to that, a reminder that evolution isn't forward or fair, it's just ongoing, and that the planet, our planet, does not promise anything, not even continuity. But still, from the edge of annihilation, life did what it has always done. It adapted. It found a new way to be. And the stage it returned to, emptier, quieter, wide open, would soon be filled by forms never seen before, new bodies, new strategies, new dominions, but not yet. For now, the Earth exhales, slowly cooling, and in the shadows the story of life sharpens its tools once more. In the flickering firelight, one can almost see the dawn of the Triassic, 200 million years ago. The world was rebounding under a broiling sun, with lush ferns and young conifers carpeting the land. Into this green haze stepped the very first dinosaurs. Unlike their future behemoth descendants, these pioneers were small and slim. They were often only a few meters long, slender two-legged hunters or gentle goat-sized herbivores, prowling the edge of swamps and forests. Picture a Curlophysis slipping through the undergrowth. To our eyes its size would seem modest, yet even these humble forms carried the spark of something immense. By the Jurassic, however, the stage was set for colossal growth. Forests stretched into foggy distance. Floodplains swelled, and plant-eaters found themselves in a banquet of foliage sauropods. The iconic long-necked giants emerged and began to dominate. These creatures literally towered over the forests. A Brachiosaurus could raise its 30-meter neck above a grove of conifers as if craning upward from a pond. Remarkably, these animals managed such girth with surprisingly lightweight anatomy. Their bones were hollow and filled with air sacs. Their heads remained small, little bigger than a large dog's, because they did not chew food but rather swallowed mouthfuls of vegetation whole. Inside, they carried enormous guts, digesting for days what they gulped in seconds. Scientists today explain sauropod gigantism as the outcome of a cascade of adaptations. One comprehensive study notes that sauropods exceeded all other terrestrial vertebrates in mean and maximal body size, and that there were no abiological factors such as global environmental parameters needed to explain it. In short, no secret atmosphere or magic growth dust was required. Their size was pure biology. Each evolutionary innovation, from bird-like lungs to a tiny skull and giant gut, built on the last together, these traits formed an evolutionary cascade that culminated in body masses far beyond what any other land animal could achieve. The predators of the Jurassic and Cretaceous were also scaling up. Once the giants roamed, a top carnivore had to be formidable too. Early Jurassic hunters like Allosaurus were already the size of modern elephants, with 2-meter skulls armed with blade-sharp teeth. By the late Cretaceous, Tyrannosaurus rex claimed the crown, a compact terror weighing around 6 tons, with a skull that could swallow a man whole and teeth like sharpened clubs, yet even T-Rex never stopped running. Paleontologists measuring dinosaur leg bones have found that theropods gradually evolved longer, lower legs relative to their body as time went on. In other words, these massive hunters got better at stride as they got bigger. One paleontologist quipped that, in terms of Cretaceous ecology, T-Rex was the lion and Nanotyrannus was the cheetah, a nod to the fact that even a bear-sized predator needed cheetah-like speed to catch swift prey. So the carnivores chased the giants with ever more lethal tools, deeper bites, ferocious muscle power, and surprisingly long legs. The herbivores answered with their own defences. Plants alone couldn't protect them from open jaws. Many became walking fortresses. A triceratops, for example, stretched 9 meters long and bristled with armaments. 3 huge horns and a broad bony frill that could block a theropod's lunge. Centrosaurus carried a dozen spiked horns in a semicircle like a living starburst. The heavily plated ankylosaurs were literally encased in armour, and ended many confrontations with a club on the end of their tail that could shatter bone. Even the stegosaurs grew bony spikes and plates. 1 row of shoulder spikes on Stegosaurus may have been as tall as a person. In short, plant-eaters stocked the Mesozoic with natural shields and weapons, and yet even that was not the final word on safety. An extraordinary nodosaur fossil from Alberta reveals the depth of the pressure these herbivores faced. The dinosaur's bony plates are preserved in place, and remarkably, scientists have detected traces of its skin pigments. It turns out this 2-ton monster was not only armoured but also cryptically coloured, darker on top and lighter below, a classic counter-shading camouflage. In other words, even a creature weighing over a ton covered in spikes and plates still needed to hide in the shadows. The study authors concluded that this mega herbivore had strong predation pressure, so strong that it evolved camouflage despite its armour. In effect, every advantage on the plant-eater's side was met by another trait on the predator's side, and vice versa. Over tens of millions of years, this tit-for-tat played out again and again. A larger herbivore had a better chance to survive a predator's attack, so natural selection favoured ever bigger bodies. But a predator that could grow even a little larger or more powerful could harvest those big herbivores more easily, so the hunters grew too. The result was an evolutionary arms race. Each horn or club on a prey animal was an invitation for a stronger bite or swifter chase from the hunters, and each increase in predator power was met by heavier armour or bulk. It was like a silent negotiation written in bone and muscle. Of course, the dinosaurs didn't know they were participating in any conscious contest. To them, it was simply life, generation after generation. But looking back, we see the pattern clearly. The same rules of evolution applied, only on an epic scale. Every trait, whether a wicked tooth or a triple-horned skull, can be read as a word in the language of survival. By the late Cretaceous, the word being spoken was really a roar. Tyrannosaurs weighed more than 5 tons and swung teeth able to sever a limb. Sauropods grew to the mass of dozens of elephants. Ceratopsians bore weapons a human warrior would envy, and every plated dinosaur flaunted its bulk and spikes. And through it all, nature's logic remained steady. Only the players and stakes had expanded. Finally, in the calm after this era of giants, one quiet realization comes to mind. Size itself had become an ecological language, an evolutionary negotiation between offense and defense. In the deepest hush that truth lingers, and it leaves us with a sense of calm awe at those ancient titans, whose legacy is not just bones but the very idea that life can write with size. In the hush after the last monstrous dinosaurs vanished 66 million years ago, life quietly carried on in smaller forms. The big titans were gone, but a subtle transformation was underway. The survivors of the Great Extinction began exploring the freed realms. Could the intelligence of animals now shape the rules of survival more than muscle or armor? Scientists wonder if this was when brain power became nature's new ultimate weapon in the endless war of life. Cenozoic landscapes shifted dramatically. Lush, subtropical forests spread, then gave way to grasslands and savannas under cooling skies. Mammals diversified rapidly into every vacant niche, from tiny burrowers to prowling hunters. In fact, paleontologists show that in the first 10 million years after the dinosaurs died out, mammal diversity exploded across continents. In this patchwork world, being big was no longer enough. Survival increasingly favoured adaptability and cleverness. As mammals spread, intelligence began to pay. Many new species were small or average-sized, so elaborate strategies conferred advantage. In jungles and plains alike, planning and learning became critical, remembering seasonal migrations, hiding infants, or deciphering rivals' habits. Social living amplified this. Creatures that shared knowledge gained the edge. Researchers argue that in such social mammals, group learning can make clever innovations effectively hereditary, lowering the threshold for intelligence to evolve. This kind of teamwork took planning. Some wolves would chase, others flank or ambush. Such group strategy allowed predators of modest size to take down deer or bison that would overwhelm a lone hunter. Naturalists even note that feline predators, like ancient saber-tooths and lions, applied similar tricks, ambushing and silent coordination rather than relying on sheer strength. Perhaps no predator was more cunning than a clan of spotted hyenas. Living in groups up to 90 individuals, these hyenas evolved brain power to match their social lives. Brain scans show spotted hyenas have an especially large cortex for their size, even larger than most solitary predators, a sign that thinking was as important to them as brawn. Their clans coordinate complex hunts with impressive efficiency, dividing roles to ambush or run prey to ground. Deep logic was etched on the hyenas' brains, honed by millions of years of social living. Elsewhere, other survivors found their own brains to be weapons. Herd animals like early elephants or horses relied on memory and cooperation. A shared alarm call or vigilant parent could save a calf from a stealthy cat. Perhaps most notably, primates, monkeys and apes, began to thrive in forests, using problem-solving and social tact to endure. They would remember where fruit trees ripened or warn others of hidden predators. Studies suggest species with frequent social learning build larger skill sets, and indeed over millions of years these brainy mammals thrived not by being the biggest, but by outthinking rivals in the old evolutionary game. By the end of this 2 million year span, a subtle but profound shift had occurred. The arms race of life was no longer only about stronger jaws or thicker hides. It had moved inside the skull brains, and social cooperation had become powerful tools. Planning hunts, teaching young, and forming alliances had proven decisive in countless lineages. In herds, packs, and flocks alike, the winners were those who could learn and improvise fastest. As night fell on the Cenozoic world, evolution had opened a new front. The fossils and genetic clues we have hinted, nature's blueprint for success. Strategy increasingly trumped sheer strength. Of course, much remains unknown. We can only infer what brains had learned from quiet clues in stone and bone, but the Cenozoic clearly hints that thinking became a weapon of natural selection. Is intelligence nature's ultimate weapon? Imagine walking through a warm Miocene forest, long before any human ancestor left a footprint. The air hums with insect calls, but underneath the chorus is something new in Earth's long story: attention. In the canopy, eyes track your passing, not in hunger, but in curiosity. A young primate, no larger than a house cat, tests you with a quiet stare. It is assessing distance, movement, perhaps intention. That small act, just a few seconds of quiet calculation, belongs to the same lineage of intelligence that would shape the rest of the Cenozoic planning had begun to matter as much as claws. In these ancient forests, a new kind of survival emerged. Animals that could predict the next few heartbeats, where a branch might bend, where a rival might leap, gained a small but vital advantage. And evolution, patient and unsentimental, rewards even the smallest advantage when it is repeated generation after generation. Large predators had once dominated these spaces, but now agility of mind became increasingly valuable. A creature that could remember the pattern of fruiting trees, or sense the subtle tension in a rival's posture, could secure food or avoid conflict without fighting. Intelligence, at this scale, was energy efficient, a way to win before danger arrived. Some scientists believe that this subtle shift, where memory and foresight replaced brute struggle, may have quietly reshaped entire ecosystems, forest dwellers that could map their homes internally, navigating branch networks like mental blueprints, rarely blundered into traps or ambush. Even small mammals benefited from this. Burrowers learned which neighbouring tunnels reliably hid predators. Tree dwellers learned the sound difference between a harmless rustle and the deliberate silence of a stalking cat. Over time, these sensory and mental talents created animals whose survival depended not only on speed or teeth, but on interpretation, reading the world like a text. Elsewhere, across young savannas forming under cooler climates, cleverness took another form: social politics. Herds grew larger, not simply for physical safety, but because many eyes and ears created a shared intelligence. A lone grazer might miss the distant silhouette of a lurking hunter, but 50 grazing together formed a quiet surveillance network. One startled glance could ripple through 1,000 bodies in seconds. This collective awareness was not conscious in the way we think of it, but it was undeniably strategic. A kind of distributed mind formed through instinct and experience. Predators responded in kind. In open plains, a hunter no longer succeeded by sprinting alone. Some learned to drive prey toward hidden packmates. Others adapted patient shadowing behaviours, keeping just close enough to tire a herd into disarray, one can imagine, on a hot afternoon 20 million years ago. A proto-wolf standing perfectly still against the glare, watching the wind shift the positions of antelope. It waits not for brute opportunity but for confusion, a moment created by fear rather than force. Such hunting required not merely instinct but the capacity to anticipate another creature's reactions. Brain tissue, expensive as it is, was beginning to offer high returns. Even birds joined the contest. Corvid ancestors, ancient relatives of today's ravens and crows, began experimenting with clever foraging, caching food in hidden crevices, even tricking rivals by pretending to hide a morsel in one place while slipping it into another. These small acts of deception show that intelligence was not simply about solving puzzles. It was about managing relationships, knowing who was watching, who might steal, who could be fooled. In this layer of the Cenozoic, the battlefield expanded into the social dimension. In oceans too, awareness became an advantage. Early-toothed whales, evolving sonar and complex communication, began hunting cooperatively. Echoes carried not only information about prey, but about each other's movements, allowing entire pods to coordinate with uncanny precision. Some fossils even suggest multi-generational groups, an early sign that learning passed through families, not just through instinct. By the time 2 million years remained before the present, the pattern had grown unmistakable. Across continents, in forests, plains, mountains, rivers, animals increasingly survived because they knew they remembered safe paths. They recognized individual rivals. They taught offspring which plants burn the tongue and which streams hid crocodiles. Intelligence had woven itself into the fabric of everyday survival. And perhaps that is the quiet revelation of this era. Nature did not abandon strength or speed or armour. It simply began layering strategy on top of them. For more than 60 million years, evolution refined the power of thought in countless lineages, long before any ape learned to shape stone. In a world still wild and dangerous, minds, not bodies, became the most flexible tools available. It makes one wonder in the darkness of late-night thought. Once nature opened the door to intelligence, was it inevitable that some species would one day walk through it? Imagine this. A small band of early humans standing at the edge of a savannah night nearly 1 million years ago, illuminated only by the bruised light of the moon. Their bodies are thin, their limbs oddly delicate compared to the monsters that move in the dark around them. They have no claws, no armour, no poisonous bite. They cannot outrun most predators. They do not have the strength to wrestle large prey to the ground, and yet they stand there anyway, scanning the horizon with a confidence that should not belong to creatures so physically unprotected. Something has changed in the eternal war between hunter and hunted. Something new has entered the battlefield. That something is glowing faintly at their feet. A controlled fire, small, flickering, and unbelievably powerful. If you had walked the earth long before this moment, you would have seen our ancestors living much like any other primate. Foraging, hiding, reacting to the world around them rather than shaping it. But sometime close to 1 million years ago, a shift begins. The silent rule that all other creatures obey. The rule that you must meet nature with only the tools you're born with, begins to break humans, fragile as saplings, start reaching for forces outside their own bodies. They do not grow stronger fangs. They chip sharp flakes from stone. They do not evolve heat-resistant skin. They learn to carry fire. They begin, in their small, tentative ways, to make the world bend toward them rather than the other way around. The first spark of this change most likely appeared in scattered places across Africa. Charred bones and ancient hearths tell part of the story. Early humans gathering around natural fires that began from lightning strikes, cautiously edging closer, learning to grab burning branches, perhaps even learning how to keep embers alive for days. We do not know exactly when they learned to tend flames deliberately, but the evidence whispers that by 800,000 years ago, fire was no longer an accident for our ancestors. It was a resource, a companion, a shield, and fire reshaped everything. At night, predators who once ruled the darkness hesitated. Hyenas skirted wide arcs around human camps. Big cats, so at ease in moonlit hunting, blinked warily at the dancing light. For the first time in Earth's history, an animal who was not large or strong controlled the night because they controlled the flame. Fire cast a new boundary on the land, not one defined by strength, but by knowledge. Once early humans could keep fire alive, they had unlocked something even more transformative. Cooked food. Raw meat demands enormous chewing time and effort. Tubers are often tough and fibrous. Many plants hold toxins or are nearly impossible to digest. Cooking changed the game. It softened hard roots, killed parasites in meat, released more calories from almost everything consumed. Stomachs could shrink, jaw muscles could relax. Time once spent grinding tough plants could now be used for exploring, socializing, thinking. Around the fire, something like culture began to flicker into being, but fire alone could not lift early humans to the top of the food chain. No flame can chase down prey. For that, they needed another invention, one as simple as chipped rock, and yet as revolutionary as anything in the history of life: stone tools. Imagine the first hands to shape a rock deliberately. The movement is not elegant. A hammerstone strikes a core and flakes jump off with a sound like glass breaking underwater. But the result, a sharp edge, is astonishing. With that edge, a small human suddenly holds the cutting power of claws, the slicing power of teeth far sharper than any the body could grow. The earlier stone tools were simple but deadly. They allowed scavenging from carcasses without risking close confrontation with predators. As technique improved, those tools became spears, scrapers, chopping tools, blades. A stone point thrust by a coordinated group could bring down animals that no single human could ever challenge. Many thousands of years later, when herds stampeded across the plains, humans learned to work as a team, driving animals into natural traps surrounding them, dividing roles with silent signals and practiced timing. What makes this remarkable is not the tool itself, but the cooperation that wielded it. Many animals hunt in groups, but humans brought something else: pre-planned strategy. They could imagine the shape of a hunt before it happened. They could communicate intentions. They could remember which tools worked better in certain conditions. They could improve designs across generations. What began as fragile, breakable shards of stone became extensions of the mind. Weapons shaped as much by thought as by muscle. By the time 600,000 years had passed, early humans had become something new in Earth's history. Predators who did not need to be physically dominant. They could stalk, wait, drive, and intimidate in ways no other primate had ever done. Bones from this era show cut marks over lion and leopard bones, not as prey of the cats, but as signs that humans had scavenged or even hunted the predators themselves. In some regions, humans took control of carcasses that once fed whole guilds of scavengers. This does not mean life was easy. These humans were still prey much of the time. They still died young, still faced starvation, still lived in a world where weather, drought, and hunger were constant threats. But the balance of power had tilted. A creature that had once cowered could now confront. The ancient war that had played out for billions of years, generation against generation, tooth against hide, suddenly had a new contender armed not with fangs but with ideas, and the battlefield expanded again. Communication grew more complex. People began coordinating over longer distances, Using gestures and vocal calls to synchronize their actions, their social circles grew. Knowledge, which in any other animal fades with death, began to outlive individuals through teaching. One human could show another how to sharpen stone, how to track hoofprints, how to predict the seasonal movements of prey. And fire made evenings longer, giving time for stories, warnings, lessons. Around those night circles the human mind stretched, across deserts, mountains and forests. This combination of fire, stone and cooperation allowed early humans to push outward in ways no other species had. They could occupy cold environments with the help of warmth, survive dark nights with the help of light, and defend themselves with weapons that extended their reach. They could walk into new landscapes and transform them simply by staying long enough, burning grasslands to flush prey, clearing brush around camps, altering the balance of predators and scavengers. This was not yet mastery of the world. That would come much later, but it was the beginning of humans becoming shapers of their fate rather than passengers in the grand story of life. And there is something humbling in that. Evolution did not give us the strongest bite or the thickest hide. It gave us hands, fire, and each other. It gave us the ability to see possibilities where other creatures saw only barriers. It gave us a way to turn fear into strategy. By 100,000 years ago, humans, still vulnerable bodies with soft skin and small teeth, had become the apex predators of their ecosystems. Not by force alone, but by attention, memory, planning, and patience. A small flame, a sharp edge of stone, and a group willing to stand together became the most powerful alliance the ancient world had ever seen. And yet, for every mystery we think we've solved about this transformation, there are 10 more we cannot fully answer. We are piecing together bones, ashes, and chipped rock, trying to understand how a frail primate claimed a throne no other species had held before. Perhaps the quiet question that remains is this: was fire the first tool that made us human, or was it the first tool that revealed what we already were becoming? Picture for a moment the dawn that follows a night of firelit safety. The horizon glows pale, the last embers crackle softly, and the long grass shivers with the slow return of diurnal life. Early humans rise from bundled sleeping hollows, stretch thin limbs, and step into a world where every movement carries consequence. They scan not only for prey, but for the traces left behind by nocturnal hunters. A single print in the dust, a snapped twig near the edge of camp, the faint metallic smell of a fresh kill somewhere beyond the acacias. Each clue helps them map the hidden geometry of danger that the night conceals. This ability to read the morning as a text, to decipher the stories left by animals in the dark, became one of their great strengths. Tracking, though it seems humble, was a quiet revolution. For most of the history of life, predators relied on short windows of opportunity: surprise, speed, scent, or sheer power. Humans did something different. They learned to follow. A bent blade of grass could reveal the direction of escape. A pattern of hoofprints could reveal panic or calm. Even the freshness of dung became a clock, marking how far ahead a herd might be. This transformed the savannah into a giant puzzle, and humans into creatures who solved puzzles for survival. In this way, the battlefield of evolution expanded yet again, from immediate ambush to long-term pursuit, and pursuit became its own kind of weapon. Persistence hunting, though only possible in certain landscapes, changed the rules for large prey. Humans who could sweat and cool their bodies efficiently sometimes followed an animal for hours under the relentless sun, not by outrunning it in a sprint, but by refusing to stop. Step by step, breath by breath, they pushed prey toward exhaustion. the final confrontation might involve nothing more than a well-placed spear or a coordinated rush. It was not strength that ended the chase, but patience. Patience weaponized across the shared will of a group. Danger, of course, was constant. A single misstep could turn hunter into hunted. Large cats still prowled, and many of them saw humans as competitors rather than threats. There were mornings when early humans approached carcasses only to find a leopard crouched behind the thorns, irritated at being disturbed. There were evenings when a pride of lions circled the edges of camp, waiting for fatigue or distraction. Humans learned to read those creatures too. The twitch of a tail, the tilt of a head, the way a predator pauses before deciding whether to charge. Survival depended on interpreting these silent negotiations with uncanny accuracy. Yet something else grew within these early humans, something perhaps more important than fire or stone: trust. To hunt large animals or defend a camp required more than one body acting alone. It required coordinated movement, mutual reliance, shared risk. When a young hunter stepped into tall grass, he depended on those beside him to hold the line. When a wounded animal wheeled around with desperate strength, others had to intervene. This trust did not come from instinct alone. It came from countless shared challenges, from nights of fear and mornings of triumph. It was culture woven through danger. The emotional world of these humans expanded accordingly. They grieved losses, for long-term cooperation makes absence keenly felt. They celebrated successful hunts, for food was communal, not individual. Around their fires, stories likely emerged, not myths as we understand them, but simple accounts of where animals had been seen, where predators frequented, where to find water when the dry season tightened its grip. These stories preserved experience beyond the lifespan of a single hunter. In a world without writing, memory became the archive of survival. Across the millennia, these layers of skill, trust, and shared knowledge reshaped what it meant to be an apex predator. Humans did not dominate by overpowering the beasts around them. They dominated by understanding them, by predicting their paths, outwitting their instincts, and coordinating with one another. Humans turned the savannah's uncertainty into an advantage, and quietly, without ceremony, a new kind of mastery appeared. Not domination by force, but dominance through comprehension. Imagine this: a cold wind moving across a late Pleistocene valley roughly 50,000 years ago, carrying with it the smoke of hearths from two different kinds of humans. One fire belongs to us, Homo sapiens, newly arrived with our strange customs and fluid social bonds. The other belongs to another lineage entirely, a people who had weathered the cold of Eurasia for hundreds of thousands of years. They were broad-shouldered, thick-boned, astonishingly strong. Their faces were heavy with muscle, their hands capable of shaping tools with a precision long honed by ice and hardship. They were Neanderthals. And for a brief moment in the ancient world, these two species lived close enough that they could smell each other's cooking fires on the wind. It is difficult to imagine now, in a world where only one human species remains, that this time was anything but inevitable. But nothing in our story suggests inevitability. For most of the last few 100,000 years, Neanderthals dominated Europe, Denisovans ranged through Asia, and even smaller lineages like the tiny humans of Flores existed in isolation on distant islands. Sapiens were one branch among many. The late Pleistocene was not a world built for a single winner. It was a world of human diversity far deeper than anything we can see today. When sapiens began to move across continents, they carried with them habits that were small on the surface but powerful in effect. Wider social networks, longer distance alliances, and a habit of exchanging materials and ideas across groups. These networks allowed them to expand through unfamiliar landscapes with surprising confidence. Neanderthals, in contrast, tended to live in tighter bands, often tied to specific valleys and hunting territories, their knowledge deep but localized. None of this made them lesser, only different. Each species was shaped by its world. Each had a claim to the land. The first meetings were likely cautious. Two sets of eyes watching each other from opposite sides of a river. Two families tracking the same herd. In some places, these meetings may have ended quietly, with each side turning away. In others, competition for a carcass or a cave mouth may have sparked tension. Archaeologists find signs that territory shifted during these millennia, with Neanderthals retreating from some regions soon after sapiens arrived. Whether this reflects conflict or simple crowding, we cannot say with certainty, but the pattern is clear. As sapiens spread, the range of other humans contracted. And yet, the story is not one of simple replacement. There are traces of intimacy embedded in our bones. Small amounts of Neanderthal and Denisovan DNA remain in many living humans today, reminders of shared moments between species. These were not symbolic unions. They were practical, personal events inside a world where humans were not divided by great distance or language, but by biology itself. Some encounters were likely gentle, others perhaps uneasy, but each left a small mark, genes that carried forward into the future long after the bodies that housed them were gone. Still, interbreeding was rare. The lineages remained largely distinct. The majority of Neanderthals vanished, not merged. Their tools, beautiful flakes shaped with a mastery earned over ages, stop appearing in the archaeological layers after a certain point. Their shelters fall silent. Their footprints fade from the caves of Europe. On the island of Flores, the tiny humans disappear almost without trace. In the mountains of Asia, Denisovans survive only as fragments of bone and teeth, their existence discovered not by living memory, but through the quiet patience of excavation. Why did we endure when others did not? Many explanations have been proposed, from climate change to disease to sheer demographic momentum. Perhaps sapiens had slightly higher birth rates, expanding faster once they entered new lands. Perhaps broader social networks meant better sharing of resources during lean years, buffering them against drought or harsh winters. Perhaps our long-distance communication allowed alliances that stretched over hundreds of kilometres, or perhaps it was simply luck, an alignment of factors that happened to favour one lineage over the others for reasons we may never fully understand. What we do know is that extinction leaves silence behind, and it is that silence we now try to interpret. In the caves where Neanderthals once lived, the layers end abruptly, their last hearths grow cold. In some regions, climate records suggest the environment shifted dramatically as glaciers advanced, squeezing populations into dwindling refuges. In others, their disappearance coincides with the arrival of sapiens, suggesting that even without outright conflict, competition for prey and shelter may have pushed already fragmented groups past the point of recovery. A species does not need to lose a war to fade away. Sometimes it only needs to lose time. And yet, archaeology tells us something else, something more human. Neanderthals cared for their injured. They buried their dead. They produced pigments and may have decorated their bodies or tools. They lived in families, raised children, and endured winters of unimaginable harshness. They were not inferior versions of ourselves. They were another answer to the question of what it means to be human. In that sense, their extinction is not a triumph, but a loss, a branch of our family tree cut short. By 30,000 years ago, the world belongs to one human species alone. Others survive only in the genetic echoes carried in our cells, We walk through landscapes once shared by many lineages, unaware of how unusual that singularity is. The late Pleistocene was the last time the Earth held multiple forms of humanity, each shaped by different histories, each carrying its own wisdom, strengths, and vulnerabilities. Sometimes, late at night, the thought lingers. If we had met our cousins in another age under different circumstances, would the story have unfolded the same way? If two species so similar could share a valley, could they have shared a future? Or was this ending written the moment our line developed the tools, alliances, and mobility that shifted the balance? We do not know. We know only what remains. Footprints fossilized in cave mud, fragments of bone, a scattering of DNA. The rest is silence, and in that silence lies the realization that we're not alone in our ancestry, and that our survival was never guaranteed. We stand on a branch others once shared, a solitary witness to a world that once held many humans, now vanished into deep time. What strikes me most, looking back across those tens of thousands of years, is how brief the overlap truly was. For all the time, various human lineages existed on Earth. The window in which they could look one another in the eye was astonishingly narrow. Neanderthals thrived for hundreds of thousands of years. Denisovans likely survived in scattered pockets through vast Asian landscapes. Yet our shared time with them, the period in which their stories and ours touched, was little more than a flicker, a handful of millennia, a few hundred generations. Compared to the long arc of human evolution, it feels like two candles that burned separately for ages and then briefly illuminated the same room before one went dark. And what happened in that room is not always visible in bone or artifact. Some moments leave no mark. A Neanderthal child watching unfamiliar figures approach a riverbank, a sapiens hunter pausing at the sound of footsteps that do not match the rhythm of his own group. A night when two groups sought shelter in the same valley and kept their fires far apart, uncertain whether proximity was safety or danger. In prehistory, so much happened quietly, without violence and without ceremony. The archaeological record preserves the hard things: stone, bone, charcoal. But the soft things, the cautious glances and shared winters, vanish with the people who lived them. Still, the few marks that do remain suggest a world more entangled than we once believed. In certain valleys, sapiens tools appear for a time, then Neanderthal ones return, as if territories breathed in and out. Some researchers see this as evidence of alternating occupancy, a landscape used by one group in a warm phase, then reclaimed by another during colder centuries. If true, it paints a picture not of straightforward invasion, but of a delicate dance between species shaped by shifting climates and changing opportunities. Survival often depends not on dominance but on timing, and sometimes timing alone determines who persists. Even the final disappearances leave room for nuance. In some regions, Neanderthals seem to vanish centuries before sapiens arrive in large numbers, implying that they were already vulnerable, perhaps fragmented by environmental stress, dwindling in population, their communities too small to recover from famine or disease. In other places, the layers show a tighter overlap, suggesting that both species used the same hunting grounds within the same generations. Whether the pressure came from climate or competition, the effect was the same: scattered groups shrinking until the thread of continuity broke. For Denisovans, the silence is even deeper. We know them almost entirely from genetics and a few pieces of bone. Their disappearance leaves no widespread archaeological wake, yet their genes appear in some populations today at levels suggesting substantial ancient interaction. This means their story didn't vanish outright. It dissolved into ours, faint but enduring. Their presence in our biology makes them at once extinct and strangely present, a reminder that extinction is not always absolute. Sometimes a species ends not through erasure but through absorption, and then there is the smallest lineage of all, the humans of floras. Their tiny stature, their island isolation, their unknown origins, all of it tells a story fundamentally different from the ice-hardened lives of Neanderthals or the mountain paths of Denisovans. When they disappear, it is without confrontation or evidence of contact. There is no sign they were pushed aside. Perhaps rising seas isolated them further. Perhaps a volcanic event reshaped their world. Their ending may not have involved rivalry at all, but the quiet vulnerability of a species with too little room to adapt. The war of existence can end through lack of conflict just as it can through too much of it. Across all these lineages runs one common thread: the fragility of small populations facing rapid change. When numbers fall too low, knowledge becomes thin, partnerships brittle, and recovery impossible. Sapiens may simply have crossed the threshold that kept their cultural memory intact. Larger networks meant more sharing of tools, food, and child-rearing responsibilities. A single harsh winter could wipe out an isolated band of Neanderthals, but a networked sapiens group might borrow aid from distant kin. In evolution, resilience often hides in the mundane mechanics of cooperation, not just in cleverness or strength. By the time the last of our cousins walk their final paths, the world was already shifting toward us. Not because we were destined to rule it, but because circumstance aligned with our particular strengths: flexibility, communication, and the ability to learn from one another across distance. We did not inherit the earth through conquest alone. We inherited it because we outlasted the uncertainties that others could not, and that realization carries its own quiet weight. For in the end, being the last human standing is not just a story of victory, it is a story of solitude, a reminder that our survival came at the cost of branches that once shared our tree, a reminder that we walk the world with the memories of those whose voices we will never hear, whose stories exist only in echoes carried forward in our blood. Imagine this: a young naturalist standing on the deck of a ship in the early 19th century, the late sun lowering itself toward the water like a slow, thoughtful lantern. His notebook is already full of sketches and questions, but still he writes, leaning against the wooden rail of the HMS Beagle as it creaks across the Pacific. He's 20-something, quiet, observant, easily seasick, utterly unaware that history will one day anchor itself to his name. His world is still one of static species and fixed creation, but in his pocket lie dusty specimens, shells, feathers, beetles, that whisper otherwise. Their shapes do not match the tidy categories of the textbooks he had read. Their patterns are irregular, their distribution is puzzling, and somewhere between his careful drawings and the shifting horizons, a deeper pattern is waiting to be discovered. When Charles Darwin stepped onto the volcanic shores of the Galapagos in the early 1830s, he did not arrive as a revolutionary. He arrived as a collector. Each island greeted him with its own bewildering puzzle: giant tortoises with subtly different shells, mockingbirds that looked almost, but not quite, like their cousins on neighbouring lands, and small brown finches whose beaks seemed to follow no obvious rule. To the sailors who lived off ship's biscuits and salted meat, these creatures were curiosities. To Darwin, they were clues. He noted everything with a kind of patient obsession. On one island, finches had thick, crushing beaks. On another, they bore long, delicate ones suited to probing cactus flowers. The tortoises varied the same way. Some had high-arched shells that allowed them to stretch their necks toward tall vegetation. Others had low domes shaped by very different diets. There was no reason for these differences if all species had been fixed in form. Yet the variations were undeniable. Over and over, Darwin sketched the same quiet question. Why? At the time, the idea of species changing over time was not new, but the mechanism behind such change remained mysterious. Earlier thinkers had speculated about transformation, but their explanations often felt more poetic than scientific. Darwin needed something firmer, something that fit both the abundant variety he observed and the brutal simplicity of nature's daily work. And for a long while, he found nothing. His notebooks over those years read like the inner monologue of a mind circling a ghost. Something was there, something threaded through the tortoise shells, the cliffs of Patagonia, the coral reefs he studied in the heat of the South Pacific. He felt it, but could not name it. The revelation began far from the Galapagos, not on a windswept island or aboard a ship, but in a quiet English study years later. By then, Darwin was back home, married, settled into the slow domesticity of the countryside. His walls were lined with specimens shipped from far corners of the world. He spent long hours examining barnacles under a lens, comparing shells, reading the works of naturalists who had observed similar puzzles. And then one day he picked up a thin book by an economist, Thomas Malthus. Malthus, thinking not about animals, but about people, wrote of population growth exceeding resources. He argued that when populations expand faster than food supplies, competition becomes inevitable. Hunger forces choices. Limited resources produce winners and losers. Only some survive. Darwin read this in the autumn light of the early 1840s, and something clicked. Here, at last, was a mechanism he'd been searching for. A quiet force that could sculpt species over time without intention or design. If more individuals are born than can survive, and if some happen to possess slight advantages, better camouflage, sharper claws, stronger beaks, then those individuals would be more likely to leave descendants over countless generations. The tiny advantages pile into something larger. Changes accumulate. Populations diverge. New forms emerge. He later called it the struggle for existence, a phrase that sounds dramatic, but in his writing felt measured, even gentle. He didn't mean a literal battlefield. He meant the subtle pressures that shape every living thing, the seed that sprouts beside 5 others but grows an inch taller and captures the light first. The fox whose hearing is a little sharper in winter. The bird whose slightly curved beak reaches the nectar no other can. These differences matter when life is difficult and resources scarce. And life, Darwin saw, was always difficult. Always. He tested the idea against every observation he'd gathered. Why do similar species appear on nearby islands but differ in small, consistent ways? Because each environment rewards different traits. Why do some fossils resemble living species in the same region more than those found elsewhere? Because new species arise from old ones, not from separate acts of creation. Why are there so many varieties of pigeons, dogs, and crops? Because selective breeding, human-guided selection, mirrors the same principle that nature uses without human intent. His study table gradually became an arena where plants and animals fought quiet battles without ever lifting a claw. He watched barnacles crowd rocks until only the toughest survived. He collected seeds from roadside plants and found that most never germinated. Too many seeds, too little soil. He saw that even in the most peaceful meadows, life pressed against the limits of space and nourishment. The world around him was beautiful, but beneath that beauty lay constant negotiation, constant pressure, constant winnowing. That realization changed everything. Species were not static. They were not fixed in their present form. They were shaped, slowly, painfully, relentlessly, by the daily work of living. The world was not built once, it was built continuously, and every creature carried within it the history of this long, subtle shaping. He began to understand that the patterns he had sensed as a young man globe-trotting on the Beagle were reflections of a deeper architecture. The diversity of finch beaks was not an odd curiosity. It was a record of many generations adapting to many tiny pressures. The tortoises were not amusing variations, they were monuments to slow change across time. By the late 1850s, the idea was complete enough for him to share, though he hesitated. He worked with meticulous caution, aware that the concept ran against centuries of accepted belief. He refined his arguments, amassed more observations, and wrote in a tone that tried to anticipate objections. He was not a man who enjoyed confrontation. In fact, he dreaded it. Yet the idea tugged at him, growing heavier with each year. Life had revealed something astonishing, and silence felt impossible. When his book finally appeared in 1859, it did not shout. It reasoned. It coaxed. It guided the reader gently through gardens, forests, and tidal pools, pointing out small truths until the larger truth became unavoidable. The world is full of more individuals than can survive. Those individuals vary. Some variations offer slight advantages. Over vast expanses of time, those advantages accumulate, and from the quiet mathematics of survival emerges the endless branching of life. What makes Darwin's insight so haunting is not that it introduced conflict into our understanding of nature, but that it recognized conflict as a quiet constant woven into existence itself. He saw that every feather, every spine, every camouflage leaf carried the imprint of ancestors who lived just long enough to reproduce. He saw that extinction was not a rare calamity, but a persistent part of life's story. And he saw that the world's immense beauty was built not just from harmony, but from uncountable generations navigating scarcity, danger, and chance. For the first time in human history, someone articulated what the rocks, fossils, and species diversity have been whispering all along. Life is shaped by struggle, not shielded from it. That single realization stitched the scattered clues of natural history into a coherent narrative, stretching back further than Darwin himself could imagine. Today we see that narrative extending not just to the Pleistocene or the age of dinosaurs, but into the deep oceans of early Earth. But in the 19th century, Darwin's view was already radical enough. It recast the world from a fixed tapestry to a dynamic, ever-branching tree, each limb shaped by the tug of survival. When he finished his most famous work, he did not claim certainty. He admitted the gaps in his knowledge. He acknowledged the questions he could not answer. He expected future generations to refine, correct, and expand his ideas. His humility remains one of the most striking features of his writing. Even as he revealed a new way of seeing life, he insisted that the story was far from complete, and perhaps that is why his insight endures. It was not a doctrine, it was an invitation to observe carefully, to think slowly, to accept that truth sometimes hides in plain sight. Darwin taught us that nature is full of quiet battles and subtle victories, and that understanding those battles requires patience rather than dogma. He reminded us that the Earth we see today is only one moment in a much longer story, shaped by forces that operate too slowly for one lifetime to witness. When he died in the late 19th century, the world around him had begun to change. New evidence emerged. New thinkers stepped forward. But the foundation he laid, this idea of a struggle for existence sculpting life over time, remains one of the great turning points in human thought. It is the moment when a single mind, working by lamplight in a quiet house, uncovered the pattern hidden beneath 4 billion years of change. After all our long journey through deep time, it is humbling to realise how recently we understood even a fraction of it. Darwin offered a lens through which all of nature could be seen anew, not as a static creation, but as a living history, rewritten every generation by the quiet arithmetic of survival. And in recognising that history, we also recognise ourselves, not as beings above nature, but as one more branch shaped by the same pressures, the same conflicts, the same unfolding story. What makes Darwin's journey even more extraordinary is how long he carried the idea in private before ever daring to share it. For more than 20 years, the thought lived quietly in his notebooks like a seed that refused to stop growing. He wrote drafts, tore them up, wrote again, hesitated. Part of this hesitation came from his nature. He was gentle, even timid, a man who preferred beetles and barnacles to argument. But part came from his awareness of what the idea implied. If species could transform, if nature shaped itself through countless tiny acts of persistence and failure, then the world was not arranged by sudden creation. It was older, deeper, more intricate. And many people of his era would not accept such a suggestion lightly. During those quiet years at Down House, he honed every example, not out of desire to persuade, but out of fear of being wrong. He tested his thoughts against pigeons bred in back gardens and against orchids shaped by delicate insect visitors. He corresponded with farmers, gardeners, and naturalists across continents, gathering stories of how small changes, often unnoticed by most, could remake whole breeds over time. He treated every scrap of information like a piece of a larger mosaic, and each time he placed a new one, the picture sharpened. But he also walked the same footpaths day after day, letting the rhythm of the countryside calm the turbulence in his mind. The hedgerows, the meadows, the quiet insects tracing arcs through summer air. These were not just scenery for him, they were evidence. Each flower blooming in competition, each fledgling sparrow that did not survive its first week, each tree spreading seeds far more numerous than could possibly take root. The struggle for existence was not a theory to him. It was the daily reality of everything alive, unfolding silently beyond human notice. Observed closely enough, even a garden revealed the fierce arithmetic behind nature's beauty. The pressure to publish came, unexpectedly, from another quarter. In the late 1850s, a young naturalist named Alfred Russel Wallace sent Darwin a manuscript. Wallace had been travelling through the Malay archipelago, enduring tropical fevers and collecting rare insects. His letter described a mechanism that sounded alarmingly familiar. Differential survival shaping species over time. Darwin read it with a mixture of admiration and dread. The idea he had carried for decades was now emerging independently elsewhere. Wallace had reached the same insight by a different road. Darwin could have resisted instead. He acted with the humility that marked his character. He arranged for both his and Wallace's writings to be presented together at a scientific meeting. In 1858, Wallace, ever gracious, acknowledged Darwin's priority and later praised his thoroughness. Their partnership became a quiet testament to how truth can arise in more than one mind at once, like a pattern waiting to be seen when, On the Origin of Species appeared next year, Darwin braced himself for criticism, but he also hoped, gently, cautiously, that the work might encourage people to see nature with more honesty. The book's success surprised even him. It circulated quickly, sparked debate, and unsettled scientists and theologians alike. Yet even as controversy rose, Darwin's tone remained steady. He refused to wield his theory as a weapon. He insisted that nature, not ego, should guide the conversation. What he may not have anticipated was how deeply the idea of natural selection would reshape humanity's place in the world. For centuries, people had imagined themselves outside the processes that shaped other creatures. Darwin showed instead that we are part of that same long, unbroken lineage, shaped by pressures, moulded by time, conditioned by survival. To him, this did not diminish humanity. It grounded us. It connected us to the living world with a thread far older and stronger than myth. In the quiet years that followed, Darwin continued to study plants, worms, and small details most people never noticed. He knew that the grandest truths often hide in the humblest places, and perhaps, as he watched the slow turning of seasons from the window of his study, he understood that the real revelation of his work was not conflict alone, but continuity, the way life, for all its struggle, remains woven together across ages, species, and landscapes. Imagine this. You're holding a book that quietly opened a trapdoor beneath biology, one that made even seasoned scientists pause and rethink what they thought they knew about life. A book that argued, with unsettling clarity, that the great 4-billion-year drama we've been tracing was not really about creatures at all, not about bodies, not about species, not even about ecosystems. It claimed that the real players in this long story are far smaller, far quieter, and far more enduring, the genes themselves. And once you let that idea settle, the world begins to look different. Every leaf, every animal, every gesture of kindness or burst of aggression becomes a kind of echo of something deeper, something replicated countless times across deep time. The 1970s were not the first moment anyone wondered how evolution works, but they were the decade when a particular kind of clarity crystallized. The idea did not appear out of nowhere. It grew out of earlier work by evolutionary thinkers who had already noticed that the patterns of survival could not be explained by individual organisms alone. A bird risking its life to warn its kin. A sterile worker ant devoting itself to a colony. A mother salmon dying after spawning. These actions made no sense if evolution favoured only individual survival. So theorists had begun searching for something more fundamental. And then in 1976, Richard Dawkins gave a name to the invisible protagonist of evolution. He called it the selfish gene. Now, the title was more metaphor than accusation. Genes are not conscious. They do not want anything. They do not whisper instructions or make plans. But Dawkins argued that if you stripped life down to its core logic, the gene was the only level at which natural selection truly operates with precision. A gene is a sequence that can be copied with reasonable faithfulness, generation after generation. If the body carrying it thrives, the gene spreads. If the body falters, the gene disappears. Everything else, beak shape, fur thickness, migration strategy, social cooperation, is simply the machinery built around each gene to help it persist. In that view, every organism becomes a temporary survival vehicle, a vessel assembled molecule by molecule to carry genetic information into the future. The shock of this idea came not from the biology, which was broadly accepted, but from the perspective. It reframed everything. The 4-billion-year war began to look less like a struggle among animals and more like a chemical tournament in which certain sequences learned, through blind trial and error, how to persist. And it meant that even the warmest acts of kindness could be reinterpreted as genetic strategies. Take the example of a bee that stings an invader. The bee dies, but the hive, full of bees carrying copies of the same genetic recipe, survives. The sacrifice is not selfless at the molecular level. It is one set of genetic instructions protecting identical sets in others. Nature, Dawkins suggested, is full of such illusions. Behaviours that appear principled or even noble may trace back to the quiet accounting of replication. But the gene-centric view did not stop at altruism. It also explained why organisms sometimes behave in ways that seem downright counterproductive. Why certain birds risk everything to defend a patch of land. Why siblings fight each other to the death in some species. Why parents sometimes abandon offspring. All these behaviours, unsettling as they are, can be interpreted as strategies that maximise the endurance of genetic variants. A mother might invest in her strongest offspring rather than feed all of them, because the strongest has the highest chance of passing on those genes. It is not cruelty. It is arithmetic shaped over millions of years. Interpreting life this way requires a kind of emotional quietness. It doesn't mean love isn't real, or that cooperation is meaningless. It means the roots of these behaviours stretch deeper than the feelings we attach to them. The nervous system, including our emotions, evolved as part of that same ancient tournament: a mammal caring for its young, a wolf staying with its pack, a human sharing food with a family member. All these acts, however tender, also help clusters of shared genetic sequences survive. A gene that scattered its copies at random through a population would find itself diluted. A gene that fostered cooperation among close relatives would find itself preserved. And so, across deep time, biology favoured strategies that bound kin together and made separation costly. Yet even as the gene-centred view gained traction, scientists urged caution. Not every trait is shaped by selection. Some persist by drift or accident. Some are constrained by developmental pathways that cannot be easily altered. Some are byproducts, not adaptations. Dawkins himself acknowledged this, but critics sometimes mistook the metaphor for a manifesto about determinism. Genes are powerful, but they do not decide your thoughts. They do not dictate every behaviour. They bias possibilities. They shape predispositions. They build the framework within which the complex improvisational dance of life plays out. What makes the selfish gene idea so haunting is not that it reduces life to chemistry, but that it connects billions of years of biological conflict into a single thread. Suddenly, the first replicator in the ancient ocean, battling entropy to make a copy of itself, can be seen as the ancestor of every gene in your cells. The alliances that formed between early microbes, the rise of multicellular bodies, the competition among dinosaurs, the social strategies of mammals, the complex dance of human cooperation and rivalry, all of it becomes part of one long story of information learning how to persist. Bodies come and go. Species flash into existence and vanish, but the sequences endure, reshaping matter into endless forms, each one a temporary experiment in survival. If you look closely at any living thing, a blade of grass, a raven, a human child, you see a continuous lineage stretching back not just to the first animals or the first cells, but to the first replicator that stumbled into existence. Every being alive today is built from the same script written in that early molecular language. Nature's creativity lies not in the bodies themselves, but in the sheer persistence of these replicating sequences that learned how to build complexity, cooperation, competition, teeth, eyes, brains, and finally, the minds capable of noticing the pattern for the first time. And perhaps that is the quiet revelation of this view. The selfish gene theory does not strip life of meaning. It simply makes us aware of the forces beneath the surface, our joys, our sorrows, our alliances, our conflicts. They are part of a tapestry woven by molecules that outlived oceans, continents, and extinctions. What we do with that awareness is our own decision. We are not puppets. We are conscious beings who emerge from a long lineage of strategies, but also capable of reflection. The genes built the stage. They shaped the instincts. But the script is no longer fixed, and when you step back far enough, something beautiful appears. The 4 billion-year war was never a war at all, not in the way we imagine conflict. It was an unfolding of possibilities. A quiet race toward endurance. Genes persisted because they could, not because they meant to. And in their persistence, they gave rise to everything that lives today. In this light, every creature is a small miracle, a temporary arrangement of matter assembled to carry a thread of ancient information one generation further. By the time the idea took hold in the late 1970s, biology had a new lens through which to view the world. Not a final answer, but a powerful one, and it left us with a gentle, humbling realization that beneath all the beauty and brutality of life, beneath the oceans and forests and cities, lies a simple imperative written in molecular form: endure if you can, replicate if you are able. Not out of ambition or desire, but because this is how life holds its place against the tide of time. And in recognizing that, we begin to see the living world with clearer eyes, not as a realm of intention, but as a flowing river of inheritance that shaped us long before we knew how to ask why. And yet, even as this framework settled into the scientific world, a quiet discomfort followed it. If you take the gene-centered view seriously, you're forced to consider something almost disorienting: that evolution is not a story written around us, but a story written through us. The mind you use to question this idea is itself a product of genetic tinkering over unfathomable stretches of time. Our capacity for wonder, our tendency to attach meaning to patterns, even our impulse to care for others are all shaped by survival strategies far older than our cultures or beliefs. It is not that genes dictate who we are, but that they sculpt the playing field on which our consciousness learns to move. Some thinkers worried that such a perspective risks stripping life of its richness, as though reducing behavior to the language of optimization could never honor the complexity of real experience. But others saw something subtler, almost tender, in the recognition that the roots of our existence run so deep that they vanish into the chemistry of a world vastly older than humanity. If anything, the selfish gene idea widens the horizon. It places every living act, from a bird singing at dawn to a scientist scribbling equations, inside a lineage that stretches back to the first molecules capable of preserving themselves in a fragile, unstable world. It reminds us that survival is not a cold calculation, but a centuries-long accumulation of tiny successes, each one allowing new forms of life to arise. One of the most elegant consequences of this perspective is that it unifies life across scales. A coral reef, a termite colony, a pack of wolves, a human society. Each is built from countless individual decisions, but all of them reflect underlying patterns that promote the endurance of certain genetic combinations. Even cooperation between strangers, something we often see as uniquely human, can be partly understood as a pattern emerging from organisms that once relied on social cohesion for survival. The gene-centered lens does not claim this explains everything, only that it illuminates an ancient scaffolding beneath the behaviors we take for granted. And strangely, when you sit with this idea long enough, humility begins to replace discomfort. You start to recognize yourself as part of a vast experiment still unfolding. The genes that shaped your abilities and limitations are not rulers, but remnants, inherited from ancestors who endured droughts, predators, migrations and extinctions. They whisper hints, not commands. They bias tendencies, not destinies. And within the small space left untouched by their influence, something astonishing occurs. You choose, you reflect. You imagine futures that those ancient molecules never anticipated. That may be the softest, most unexpected ending to the story of the selfish gene. After billions of years of blind replication, one lineage of survival machines developed the ability to look back and understand what shaped them. We became witnesses to our own origins, a species capable not only of surviving, but of asking gentle, late-night questions about why survival matters at all. In that moment, the gene-centered view no longer feels mechanical. It feels like an invitation to see life more clearly, with reverence rather than fear, knowing that even the smallest threads of inheritance carry a history far longer than our own memories.